Thanks for coming to our presentation. Okay. Yeah. So as we were introduced, we're actually two organizations. I'm from the University of Alberta, which is in Edmonton, and Dave is from Cybera. And Cybera is a non-profit organization, and maybe you want to talk a little bit about what that is.
Yeah, well, we'll be talking about that a bit more later on as well, but we're basically the ORAN in Alberta, so you have similar ORAN groups in various provinces. For example, in Ontario, you have Orion. So we're the ORAN in Alberta, and we do some things beyond networking, and we'll talk about that a bit afterwards.
So we'll go for it. So we were already introduced. So basically, I'm the Director of Client Services. So one of my roles in previous to client services area was I was the labs manager for many years. So when we started out in this project, I had that area reporting to me, and it's something that's very dear to my heart about how to get labs going. And when I first found out about virtual computing lab, it was at EDUCAUSE, and it was about 10 years ago, and we started looking at this, and we tried to get this going, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And so what we decided to do is we decided to join up with Cybera and do something that's for the entire province rather than just the University of Alberta. We'll talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, and maybe just to give you an introduction into the Virtual Computing Lab, I don't know if everyone's entirely familiar with it. We thought we'd give you just a quick demo. So basically what it is a means of providing a virtual desktop for student use. I think one of its key purposes is to provide specialized pieces of software through a virtual desktop environment. So for students at the University of Alberta, the way this works is they would come to this web interface here where they log in. So you can you have basically, once you scale, this has different ways of logging in. So you can have local accounts, and the University of Alberta, they can just use their LDAP system to log in as well. And if you build it to other institutions, you would basically have more drop-down options there. So I'll just use my local account here. So you would log in, and then there's kind of a management reservation / assignment system here. So you come into the VCL interface here. So on the left-hand side, you have your different options as a user. So you have new reservations. So before you can get started with a virtual image, you have to create a reservation. So you can either do that for now. So if you want to use the virtual machine right now, you would make the reservation for this point, or you can do it for sometime in the future. So if you know you have an assignment due on Thursday, you can, book a virtual machine for Wednesday night, depending on how much you procrastinate, right? And here are just the different options for images. So depending on how many classes you offer using VCL, or what software you're offering. So actually images can also be shared between different classes. So for example, if the tool of interest is MATLAB, then you can share that amongst multiple classes. So that drop-down list here kind of gives you access to whatever image you want. And actually another interesting feature, and we'll be talking about this a bit later on as well, is so through the authentication system, we have access to the students' enrollment information, basically. So every student at U of A can log in, but not every student has access to all the images, right? So for example, we have a CIVI image here, so civil engineering. So only the students that are enrolled in the appropriate class would see this image here. So if you're not enrolled in any of the VCL classes, you basically wouldn't have access to any of these images. And conversely, even if you're enrolled in multiple of the classes, you would see multiple of the applicable images.
So one of the advantages of doing it that way is that we can have our enrollment through PeopleSoft, through our PeopleSoft system. They're enrolled in classes. If they drop a class or they add a class later, they're automatically added to have access to these images based on the courses that they're enrolled in. And then if the course is offered many times a year, as the new students come on and the others go off, they'll automatically have access to these images for those courses. So it's very specific on course kind of based idea, not really on a physical kind of lab image. So it's a different way of thinking about it. Mm-hmm. But it does reduce the overhead of management significantly.
So basically, you would just to continue along with this here, you would just put in your parameters of when you want to create a reservation. You click on create a reservation, which takes you to the current reservations field here. And I actually just set up a reservation here before. So once it's ready, you basically click on the connect button, which takes you to the next page. You have to download this password that you get for your session, get your RDP file, you log in through RDP, save it, and then basically log in with your password here. And off you go. And then basically it's just like it's just like basically a virtual desktop. So you have your Windows 7 image here that this runs on, and you can fire up your applications and whatnot. So that's basically kind of the demo, the quick overview of how it works. So maybe we'll just head back into our presentation here.
Yeah, so if students are running this on their laptops, they can still save things to their local desktop. They can save things to local USB drives, for example. So they can use their own desktop along with this desktop at the same time. So you can move files in between the two fairly easy.
Yeah, exactly. And so then this is kind of, let's see if we have the point here. This kind of just goes over what we just discussed. So the students basically can log on from any internet-capable device, so from their laptop at home, on campus, or wherever they are. Or they can log in from one of the computer labs on campus, as it's traditionally done, or was done before you had virtual resources as well, through the internet. So they go to the scheduling provisioning module at vcl.ualberta.ca, which accesses the VCL database and manages the images and the user enrollment information. And that provisions then the virtual machine on your actual hardware, spins up a VM, and again, through the internet and remote RDP, your RDP session, you access your VM. And then just one piece that I wanted to add in here is a network address translation. Because we're not a post-secondary institution, so our IPv4 addresses are quite limited. So we implemented NAT so that we can conserve our address pool.
All the infrastructure is run through Cybera, runs the infrastructure, and U of A uses that infrastructure for our courses. So the two roles in this project are basically, we're managing all of our enrollment, we're making sure all the students have access, we're dealing with the professors, we're dealing with the software issues, and Cybera is dealing with the hardware and the support of the actual infrastructure.
Yeah, that's right. And so the NAT piece and all the managing IP pools and things like that, that's all on Cybera's end. Okay.
Okay, so we were at a session earlier on Sunday, and the guys from North Carolina, Raleigh, North Carolina, who actually built this system, had this slide, and we wanted to show you guys this because we want to show how many places are actually using this tool that we've adopted at University of Alberta, and hopefully we'll go more province-wide within Alberta. And there's quite a few that are coming up. There's also some in Mexico, there's some in Hong Kong, Paris, and so it is actually growing. People are using it for different purposes, for research clouds. They're also using it for VCL, like how we're using it for the computer labs, and they're also using it for other purposes as well. So just want to show that the growth is there. I think we were the first in Canada to use it, but there are other institutions coming on as well.
Yeah, so in Ottawa and they're actually starting to use
Ottawa
it as well.
and Carleton are doing some research, and I believe Halifax, I don't know which university is, they're doing something as well with research, more so.
And that's actually an interesting aspect that we're not really going to be talking about today, but VCL can also be used, and that's actually one of the primary uses at North Carolina State University, where they pioneered the system, is for HPC applications as well. So you're kind of sharing cycles. So anything that's not being used for educational purposes for student labs is being used by the HPC community. So there's that aspect to it as well, but for we didn't go that route.
We were focusing mostly on the labs part of it, but what you can do is those unused cycles during the summertime, you could flip this over to research, and research could use these facilities as well. So that's how it sort of was actually born, to use both facilities, but we focus mostly on the lab portion.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just want to give you an overview of what University of Alberta Computer Labs actually looks like. So we have about 1,800 computers right now. We have 47 different locations, and those are the computer labs that are currently managed by our central unit. There are a lot of other smaller labs that are managed locally by departments and faculties. I would say there's lots out there. I don't know how many more there are. 80% of our labs are PC, and we do have some Unix and some Mac applications as well. This year, and I'm sure all the in the other institutions in Alberta, we were all cut from our evergreen funding for all of our computer labs. So right now we're on a 4- and 5-year cycle, so we're looking at extending that out. So something like this is actually quite advantageous to get people to think about using a facility like this rather than renewing all their computers. And our VCL pilot this year, we started out with 40 students, and in the fall term, we'll probably have about 500 concurrent students that will be registered using this next year. So basically, we want to talk to you a little bit about the pilot. So we're still really in a pilot stage. The first part of the pilot was where we really tried to find one course, only one course that would actually try to use it. And we actually got some people from our economics group who had a small lab, and they were looking at, they'd like to look at other options. They didn't want to get rid of their lab. They wanted to just, they were willing to try it, but they wanted to keep their lab as well. So we agreed, and we said, okay, well, why don't you try it? And then once you feel comfortable, then you can decide if you still want to keep that lab or not. So that started in 2011. In 2012, what we focused on was really changing the back end. So we started out with virtual machine and went to OpenStack.
So yeah, VMware, I think is what you're thinking of.
Yeah, VMware. Sorry.
So, and we also focused on scalability. So we started off with, like Donna said, one class, and we had, I think, about 40 students or so. So when you're dealing with 40 students, you can deal with local accounts and managing images and manually assigning students to images and things like that. But once you're starting to think about enrolling, 500,000 or 2,000 students in VCL, obviously you can't use local accounts anymore. So that's when we had to work through some of the privatization agreements with the University of Alberta and get through all that paperwork to make sure that we can access the university's LDAP authentication system and pull that information for student logins. So what classes are they enrolled in, and then automatically assign images to those students based on what classes they're enrolled in.
Yeah, really the part that we were working on is the LDAP integration with the service, so that we could actually use our PeopleSoft records to automatically enroll students and unenroll students and use their single sign-on facility that we had at the University of Alberta already, where people could log into the service just using the same ID and account. Because when we did 250 students the first time into civil engineering, the overhead of just entering all these accounts and then knowing when people were dropping the class and adding students to the class was a lot of overhead. So we spent a lot of time trying to fix those kinds of things and this part. And it's been very, very successful, actually.
And so now in 2013, we're really trying to scale up and out. So we're trying to push it hard at the University of Alberta to get other classes on board. So I think for the fall, Donna mentioned, we'll have some more engineering classes on board. So we're looking at, I think, going to 500 and over 1,000, 2,000 students in the fall and winter semesters.
So actually, we're trying to look at problems that we can solve. So our challenges that we can solve. So we have a lot of students that use MATLAB on our campus for engineering. And we have 400 students that use it usually during the fall term, and over 1,000 or more that use it in winter term. So we decided what we'll try to do is try to conquer that problem. We'll really push the scale of VCL out and get as many students as we can using it concurrently. What the issue for us is right now is a lot of students use the student pack. So we have to sell these things to students and give them licenses, and it's a real pain. So if we could get this going, it would improve access for students so they could access this all the time. They don't have to come back and buy the license every year. So if they go on to multiple courses within engineering, they'll continue to have access to that as long as that course requires, is identified to have MATLAB as a thing that they need. So we're looking at hopefully getting that running. So
this is kind of to recapture what we just said. So we're going to add.
Well, no, this is talking about Mathematica. So basically what we talked about was we had Mathematica class that runs every fall, and we had 250 students using that image. And they also used a traditional lab. So it was a blended thing. But we still saw a lot of the students using it during the day and at night for doing their assignments. So they don't really have to come to campus. There's lots of benefits for them to use that. And it went really, really well. So we talked about change platform. Okay.
Yeah, so these are some of the things we already talked about. Maybe I'll also talk about changing of platform.
Yeah.
Like Donna said, we were using VMware to start, but actually one of the things we did was to move to an OpenStack cloud and hosting VCL on top of an OpenStack cloud. And actually my colleague Barton just gave a presentation about one of another project we have going on at Cybera, which is a shared infrastructure for a learning management system. So the learning management cloud is what we call it at Cybera. And that also runs in an OpenStack cloud. And so what we were kind of thinking long term, it would be beneficial to have a uniform backend in place, because then hopefully we can leverage efficiencies of scale even more. So future plans, so we have a VCL project going on at Cybera as a shared service for post-secondary institutions in Alberta. And we have things like the Learning Management Cloud project as well. That's a shared service between students. So, rather than having a cloud here for this service and a cloud there for that service, ideally we would be able to merge the clouds and make a larger education cloud that can host all the services on it, and then truly leverage efficiencies of scale and flexibility and basically, being able to provision on-demand resources when you need it.
Yeah, so U of A has been the one kind of leading the charge in getting this going, but there's a number of other small colleges that are actually going to start using the system this fall, I believe.
Yeah, so we're working with some small colleges such as Ambrose University College.
Yeah, and we've also got some interest in some of the libraries actually using this service for letting people borrow software. So we're looking at how we could do that within Alberta. So there's some interesting things going on. Mm-hmm. So I know you guys came here to find out, well, what are the efficiencies of running a virtual computing lab? Well, basically what we found out from our little trial with economics is that originally they wanted to keep their lab. There were no way they were giving that up, because they knew that worked, and they were not convinced that their students would use it. They weren't convinced that they would actually like it, and they were worried it would be going down and it was new and scary and virtual and all that. And basically what we were trying to tell them is we don't have to have all these things. So here's a little cartoon guy, but basically, we don't have to have cleaning. So we don't have to clean this room. We don't have to worry about the room's open. We don't have to worry when it's closed. It's open all the time except when there's a maintenance window. So there's some huge advantages and cost reductions there. We don't need the hardware on the desktop. You could still use a lab, but you don't need one. People can use their laptops. They can use really any device that can use an RDP client. So all those things are not required. You don't need special air conditioning. Maybe for the servers, yeah, you have some stuff in the server room, but we don't need an air-conditioned room. We don't have to pay for that anymore. We don't have to have desks with rows and rows of desks. We don't need lighting. All these things are being saved. So those are some of the things that we think are some of the value of it. So we put together an example of actually the savings that you could get by just running this one lab. So it was a very small lab. It was 9 computers in the lab. And we looked at, well, what if we evergreen that hardware? It would cost us $40,000 to evergreen that hardware every 5 years. So it's based on a 5-year cycle. We looked at the Microsoft PALs and things that we would need to run for the images. We put that in there. Some of the software. So really the benefit of VCL is having access to expensive software that can only be accessed either through the university, like the students can't afford to buy their own student license. In some things that was the case. We also looked at, well, what is our ongoing support cost to support those kinds of labs? So we figured that out we had a total cost of ownership model that we used to put the support in there. So basically, it was $72,000. We figured that would cost to run that facility for 5 years. And so we broke it down per student, because when you look at VCL, you have to look at per student cost. You can't look at per seat cost, the same thing you do in a traditional lab, because it's really servicing a student, not a particular physical device. So with VCL, we said, well, we had 40 students. right? So we said, well, we took the hardware, and the hardware that we have currently, we figured we can probably run more on it, but we're being kind of on the conservative side that we could run 2,000 enrolled students. And that's a bit oversubscribed, 5 to 1. Right? Yeah, about that?
Yeah,
yeah,
something like
yeah. So because what we found out is, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but most people aren't on concurrently. The big number that you have to consider if you go into this VCL environment is your Microsoft licensing. So right now, Microsoft requires that you use VDA licensing for this type of model. So you have to pay for a CAL to connect to the server, even though it's not a Microsoft server, but you need to pay for that. You also need to pay for a Windows license that says, oh, there's a Windows, we're using Windows 7. So we need to pay for the Windows 7 license for each student. We also need to pay for that usage over as if they were a contractor, because they're using their own device to access it, not one that we own. So these additional costs are there. Now, we chose to do Windows 7, and we chose it for a particular reason, because that's what the students were used to using. And we didn't want to have a barrier of them trying to get into Linux and try to understand that, as well as work with VCL. So you can use openware, Linux or some other software, so you don't have to pay these licenses if you don't want to. So that is an option. Also, we're exploring that you can run just strictly an application. So you may be able to avoid some of the Microsoft licensing issues. However, we are still continuing to work with Microsoft and say, is there another way that we could model this a little differently so we can bring some of these costs down? But it is something you need to consider. Software, I put a little bit higher because in this instance, we did some licensing per student. Some of the licensing, depending on what you're purchasing, will depend on how that company licenses their product. One of the challenges we had, particularly in econ, is they used a piece of software that required that it only be in a building. So we had to have a server in that building that could only run that software, only used by those students. And it was a small company, so we kind of said, well, you know, really, you say that you're flexible. We can prove to you by using this tool, we can restrict only econ students can use that software, which we can. So we can enroll only that course can use it. We can demonstrate, you know, that I don't know if they're going to physically use it in that building. They can use it really anywhere. But as long as they're only using the software, does that really violate your license? And so they finally agreed that they would let us do that, and it hasn't been an issue. So there's always some challenges, I think, on the licensing side when you look at if it's physically on university computers or can it reside on student computers. The support costs basically are a little bit lower because you're only managing the server side. You don't have to worry about workstations. You don't have to worry about computers. You don't have to send little, we have student proctors that go around and clean all the keyboards and clean all the monitors and all that kind of stuff. So you reduce your costs significantly there. Now, what I did not include in the analysis was anything for UPS, for example, or anything for, what else did I not include in there?
some of the power costs.
Yeah, the power costs. So if there's power savings. So, you know, when you look at thin client technologies, when you look at that option for your computer labs, if you're looking at that, some of the savings they'll say to you is, oh, you don't use as much power. In this case, we don't use any power. Students are using their own laptops, but they could be plugging into power on campus. So it's hard to like figure out if there's actually cost savings on power or not. So it's kind of left out of the equation. But if you look at the cost per student, basically we're down to $995 on the VCL side versus $1,800 on the traditional computer lab side. So about 50% savings.
So
and that'll actually scale up larger as you do larger classes.
And I think what one of the things to notice here is that you're obviously saving a lot in terms of hardware, and so you're really counting on that, and you have to shift your thinking a bit in terms of spending less on hardware but spending more on software. Right. And so I wanted to just kind of lay out how we're I guess achieving these numbers and what we have in place to host the VCL service. So we have 8 nodes basically, and out of those 8 nodes, one is a management node. So we have 7 nodes effectively that provide roughly 200 cores for your virtual machines. And the interesting thing about VCL is that it's kind of stateless. So the VMs don't have to persist, right? So a student makes a reservation, he launches a VM, which ties into his storage system at the University of Alberta, but that's kind of separate. So he can do some work, store it on his U of A storage system, but the VM essentially is stateless. So it comes up and it's broken down again at the end of it. And next time you use it, you fire up a new VM. So there's nothing persistent there, right? So because of that, you can kind of leverage certain efficiencies. Basically, so what we do is we have what we're incorporating right now is solid state drives in all the nodes, and so we stripe across the solid state drives, and through that you can basically get a lot faster input-output speeds, right?
Yeah,
through that you can, and through the KPM hypervisor, you can do things like memory sharing and CPU sharing, and so then you can overcommit each core that you have. And what we're estimating is that you can overcommit roughly 5 to 1. So you have roughly 200 cores that you can work with, and that gives you access to roughly 1,000 VMs. So then, based on what we've heard from NCSU, who run a huge VCL implementation for tens of thousands of students, what they observe is that you can enroll roughly between 10 and 25 to 1 student per VM, which means, because they're, of course, they're enrolled in the courses, but not all the students are using the VMs at the same time, right? So you can have a roughly 10 to 25 to 1 ratio there. And so if you do that, then, you can see how suddenly with very little hardware, you can serve a lot of students, basically.
Yeah, we should also note in VCL, which we didn't really demonstrate that well, is that if you wanted to have a traditional lab, like you wanted to have all the students to have access to an image at 2 p.m. For an hour every Tuesday and Thursday, there is a reservation system in there that you can do that. So you can reserve VMs for students, and you could have you could hold it in a traditional computer lab or have people accessing it with their own laptops. Mm-hmm. At a specified time, if you wanted to do it as a group.
So if you want to do in classroom, in lab teaching, that kind of thing, then you can reserve them all at the same time. Right. So some of the use cases that we dealt with, like Donna pointed out, Mathematica, MATLAB, and Stata. What it usually works best for is kind of the more expensive pieces of software that are not too resource intensive. So one piece that always comes up is Photoshop, and everyone wants to use Photoshop in a virtual environment. And so Photoshop actually works, but I think it depends a bit on your expectations and on your use case again. So and your personal setup, really, because if you're accessing it from home and you have a very poor internet connection, then obviously your experience is not going to be as good. But if you're going to access it on campus where you have a very strong, hopefully, internet connection, and you're connected to your peer network and other things like that, then your user experience will be better, right?
Yep.
So these are only some examples, but if you look on, again, I always go back to North Carolina State, because they have the massive behemoth of an implementation at their institutions. So if you go to their website, they have a whole list of over 70 software pieces that they offer through VCL. So what we started to do is kind of only scratching the surface of what can be done.
Yeah. Also, I should note that for MATLAB and Stata, we use a licensed server that we already have on campus for those facilities, so that you can use licensed services that you have. You can use VCL, works with that, and we've proven that out. Okay, so because people always are concerned about Microsoft licensing, I did break it down a little bit here to show you an example of what that costs if you're thinking about running Windows 7. So we pay, this is our contract at University of Alberta. So every contracts are different. So you have to go to your Microsoft contact and talk to them. We spent a lot of time. We had to actually send diagrams of VCL so they could understand exactly what we were trying to do, because it's completely different from anything that they had come across before. So we actually sent that down. It went down to Microsoft, somewhere in Microsoft, and they came back and they said, this is the model that we currently have that will allow you to be compliant. So these costs are over, ours is a 3-year contract. So this is a cost over 3 years of what we would pay per student to use the service. So we pay the $9 for the Windows access information, $25 for the desktop, and for the virtual access is $100 for the 3-year period per student.
Full FTE or just the 40?
Pardon? Oh, sorry, can
Full
I?
FTE or just the 40 licenses that currently?
Okay, it'd be per FTE. So the question was, is it just for the 40 students? No, it's per student that you may be running. So if we're running 40 students in that course, we need to pay for 40 of these. Right? If we run 100, we have to pay 100. Okay.
Headcount or
it's,
FTE?
Yeah, it's basically we're doing it on headcount right now because it's to our advantage to do it that way because we don't have as many students enrolled. But as you would grow it out, you'd have to negotiate something that's a little different than what we're currently doing. So we just did it by student count. Also, you can remember that you can reuse these. So if you have 40 students enrolled and then they're not enrolled for the next term, you can reuse those for other students. So when you're starting out small, this is the way I would recommend to do it because it's the most cost-effective way. But again, I think there's quite a few people, even the guys from North Carolina, we're all trying to get together and see what we can do with Microsoft licensing. But you don't have to use Microsoft. You can use versions of Linux as well on this, and so you can avoid those license fees if you choose to. So some of the decisions you have to make if you want to get into VCL is decide, do you want to do Microsoft licensing? Do you not? Is that going to fit your clients? So when we look at MATLAB, we're thinking we could probably use Unix because a lot of engineering students, they're used to using Unix environments. So we maybe don't need to do that, but you have to decide what's the best fit for the purpose of what you're going to do for that course. Do you want to use this facility for research as well as for computer labs? So you need to make that decision up front. If you decide, oh, I want to use VCL for clustering research, you might want to just focus on that at the beginning. But if you want to use it for computer labs, you may want to focus on just running it as a computer lab environment and then add research into it later. So I would suggest focusing on one or the other. And you have to think of a mind shift in spending. So instead of spending your money on hardware that you're going to populate your labs with, you have to think about spending it on software because you'll need more software licenses for students to be able to run in this kind of model because it's on a student model. North Carolina said they spend about $400,000 a year on their installation, and I think they had 40,000 students, something like that, using it.
I think even,
yeah. So, you know, it's still going to require some money. You have to think, is this fit for purpose? Does this fit your institution? Will your institution use and have laptops? If you have a laptop program already, it could be great for you. If you don't, you know, or if the students aren't required to have laptops, is that going to work or not? Student feedback. So we'll go through this fairly quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So sorry.
So basically, we provided students with a survey, and we got 100% positive feedback in terms of everyone liked having VCL as a service present. So everyone thought it was an improvement to what they had before. So in that sense, it was positive. What did they use it for? I think predominantly homework. A few students did not use VCL because they already had local installations of the software that was offered through VCL. So what did they like it for? Things like
it was convenient.
It's convenient, of course, and access from anywhere. I think that's a big piece. When you think about lab access times, especially on weekends, they're only open, I think, for the lab that we were looking at between 10 and 5. So, you know, you extend your access time a lot. And just some data on how often they access VCL. So, you know, on average, I think once a week or more. And then this is also interesting. So where did the students access VCL from? So the majority accessed it from home, and only a small proportion of the students accessed VCL from the previous computer lab that they were restricted to before.
Right.
So you can see that, you know, they're not too tied to their physical, to their lab that they were using before.
We should also mention that they're using it concurrently within Econ. They added a bunch more classes onto it. They basically are wanting to get rid of their lab now. And so they are actually embracing this quite a bit.
And what would they like to see improved about VCL? So they would like to see additional software offered through VCL, and also the reservation process. So you still need to go in and make a reservation. Even if you're ready to use your image right now, you still have to go in and make that reservation. So they would have liked to see that simplified.
Yeah. This is just a quick slide of the benefits compared to a traditional lab. And so those are fairly straightforward, basically.
And I think, yeah, the big one there, I think, is being able to offer access to course essential software 24/7 for 365 days a year, right? So they don't need to, they're not restricted to lab opening hours, and they don't have to make the commute onto campus if they need to use that that essential piece of software, especially when you consider winter times and things like that. That can be very important.
And I think this slide, we're just trying to show that even though it is available 24 hours a day, still the majority of usage is before 11 o'clock at night. So they don't, I guess when there's exams, when we looked weekly, sometimes on a weekend, if there was a big assignment due, we'd see a lot of usage. But traditionally, they are not spending all night working on this thing. So this just looks at the relationship between Cybera and how that we're working with other partner institutions across Alberta to provide this service to students, not only in higher ed, but in K-12, and possibly, as we discussed earlier, some interest from libraries to look at using this as well. So this just sort of shows Cybera's map of the things that they do.
Mm-hmm. And then this is kind of directly in terms of how the collaboration is structured. And I think Donna spoke to this a bit earlier, but basically you can see that Cybera handles kind of the bottom portion of the triangle there in terms of we handle the infrastructure support, and we provide support to U of A's support team. So the U of A support team in turn handles kind of requests from the students and image assignment and things like that. For each of the courses.
Yeah, so we would work directly with the instructors and the students and make sure that the images are actually created, and Cybera runs the infrastructure piece.
Mm-hmm. And so, as we were saying, we're scaling up and out, so we're potentially looking for other interested institutions in Alberta that would like to try out VCL and operate at their institution. So if there's anyone that's interested, please come and speak to us.
So, really trying to look for partners. So find someone who's adventurous and wants to try out a different type of environment for their courses and is willing to work with their students. And we had quite a few professors. They actually created their own little YouTube videos for students to go and look at and how to use VCL, because the reservation system is probably the most complicated thing to use. But we did have one comment from a student that said, with my marks, if I can use it, anyone can. So it's not that hard to learn. Begin small, try a couple of classes, and see how it works, and then go by word of mouth. You have to consider the cost of the hardware versus the time that you're actually spending upgrading all your labs and all the installations that you do of your traditional computer labs. And licensing will be probably the biggest challenge that you have, is how to get this licensed for the different software programs that you use. We found that it does take some discussion. Some companies don't care as long as you pay. Some are more interested in how you're delivering it. And that seems to be the bigger ones like Adobe and Microsoft that have more concerns.
And we just wanted to thank a few people as well that have been very helpful throughout the process. So the NC State University I've mentioned a few times. So they're really interested in helping people deploy VCL in different locations, and they're super resourceful. So if you ask them any questions, they'll be more than happy to help you out with anything. As well, IBM helped us get started with the VCL pilot as well. Then Blackbridge Networks is at the data center in Alberta that we're hosting it at. And also the University of Alberta, Lethbridge, piloted a few classes with us. And finally, the government of Alberta provided some funding support for the project as well.
Also, North Carolina State, they also provide boot camps for VCL. So if you're interested in setting it up, they usually run them during the summertime. You'd have to contact them to find out if you can sign up for one. They usually try to get a few people, and then they'll run a course for, it's usually about, I think 2 to 3 days is about what, tip to go down.
And I think there's one actually starting today or something.
Yeah. So if you have any questions, I know we're kind of running out of time.
So there's actually a live Q&A
Okay.
question.
Sure.
You addressed this before, but were there any challenges with licensing when you started virtualizing software?
Yes, many, but we've crossed, Stata was really easy. SPSS says, IBM says they now have a router that allows you to run SPSS in this environment. MATLAB works with licensing server. So we've kind of crossed some of those barriers. It depends what you're going to do and what the contracts are.
Maybe the second question not Q&A is, have you considered using this for staff computer images?
Staff computer images. Actually, that's interesting because I think Lethbridge wanted to try that and some remote staff. The thing is, it's not really meant to be persistent. It's they're sacrificial images. So that's the concept of what it's built on. So if you provision, you want staff to have that persistent image, it's probably not the best solution for that.
I guess there's some privacy.
Yeah.
You did assume, in your pricing model, you assumed that the lab goes away, correct?
In the pricing model, the lab goes away, yes.
The lab goes away, okay. So the $1,800 cost, I mean, that's not the back-end infrastructure either. I mean, where is that? Where are those dollars? I mean, Cybera paid for them and.
No. So that is that. So
Yeah.
so that's why we presented the subsequent slide. So if you're looking at basically the hardware that it's running on costs about $100,000, but you can basically enroll 10,000 students on that hardware. So if you consider that hardware running for 4 or 5 years, then you're looking at costs like that. So that's really where the efficiency, a lot of the efficiency comes from.
Right. Yeah.
The other question, when you did do the lab, because I know many of our faculty said, no, we don't want our lab shut down for sure.
Yes.
When you did look at your lab, did you look at hardware that was cheaper, think client-based? Did you get away with things like that? Or did you just have to go to a desktop model?
Well, what it's based on is based on a fat client, but we're using Citrix provisioning tools to image the workstations with. So there is a localized server to push those images out onto those workstations. When you look at what I did when I did the costing, was I looked at a number of labs over our entire campus and I took an average of that because some labs are more expensive than others. Will your professors not want to get rid of their labs? Absolutely, yes, they will not want to. So what we tried to do is approach people where their labs were coming up for evergreening and saying, oh, we know this cost is coming up. Would you like to try this? You don't have to get rid of your lab. We're not going to force you to, but try this because maybe we don't need it or maybe we don't need as many computer labs. Like even if we could reduce the amount down from 4 labs to 2, there would still be savings overall in the organization.
Have you tested it with any graphic intensive applications like AutoCAD or anything like that?
Yes, we've actually tested it with some of the CS6 programs. So David alluded to that a little bit.
So for 3D manipulations and multimedia editing, so in terms of video streaming and things like that, it's not ideal for that stuff. For AutoCAD, I don't think we actually tried AutoCAD, but so I mean that's something we'd have to try out.
And we didn't try AutoCAD, but we did try 3D imaging and rotating of, if you're going to do 3D modeling, it'll be a bit jumpy.
Again, it depends kind of on your setup as well, right?
Right.
You can do 3D modeling. Mass University Engineering Group. Fellow by the name of Michael Kerwin is doing it AutoCAD 3D modeling software. It actually works phenomenally. He's had articles published about it using VMware and UCS.
Yeah.
So if you want to check out something on that,
VMware has an accelerator card in its server to accommodate that, which is why I'm wondering about their backend infrastructure.
Yeah, he's using PC over IP.
Yes. Right. So to counter that, I'll say what VCL is doing. So what they're actually looking at is we use RDP accelerator code. So that we haven't really tested that ourselves, but they have tested it other places and they say it does improve performance. We haven't tested it that yet.
Are the student images, when they've got them scheduled, are they limited to one image at a time? And are they isolated from each other, or can they make them work like, I'm thinking more from a networking lab, network training type?
I think they can run multiple images of the different types. I don't think you can have 2 images So if you have that, for example, the civil engineering image, I don't think as a one user you can spin up 5 of those at the same time, so it limits you to 1. But I think that you can actually adjust that in the from the administrator's perspective. So if you wanted that for a special class or for a special use case, I think you could give us, a class special permissions to kind of run special cases like that.
And I would also say, we're trying to be realistic about what we think that this could replace. So we don't see every lab on our campus disappearing. We see a percentage of them could use this. But we would see high-end labs that use, like we have a Cintiq tablets, and we have a lot of art and design as well on our campus. We don't see that that's going to really be viable for that. But certainly for a lot of undergraduate courses, it certainly is something that can really replace what they currently do. Okay, our time?
I think
Right.
ready for breaks. Breaks up on the 4th floor in the sponsor area and also the 3 center concourse. I know it's right outside, but there's